Friends, welcome back. Today we are looking at something that is not just a headline, not just a political spat, but a fundamental crack in the facade of the global capitalist order. We are looking at a moment that history will likely record as a turning point, a moment where the internal contradictions of United States hegemony stopped being theoretical and became immediate, brutal, and economic. We have to talk about the situation unfolding between the United States, led by Donald Trump, and Canada, now under the stewardship of Mark Carney. And I want you to understand this not as a personality conflict. This is not about whether you like Trump or dislike Carney, but as a structural collision that was inevitable given the way global capitalism has developed over the last 80 years. What we are seeing is the bill coming due for an empire that has long lived beyond its means, an empire that has confused financial dominance with actual material productivity. Let us start with the demand itself because it is breathtaking in its naked transactionalism. Donald Trump has presented Canada with a bill for $2.8 trillion. Now, in the logic of the system we live under, this is framed as a reimbursement. It is framed as payment for decades of military protection and what Trump calls unfair trade imbalances. But let us be very clear, as Marxian analysts, what this actually is. This is the logic of the landlord. This is the logic of the feudal lord demanding tribute from the vassal. The United States is effectively saying that its military power is a service for which it must be paid explicitly in cash, regardless of the economic treaties or alliances that have stood for nearly a century. This $2.8 trillion figure is not arbitrary in the mind of the American administration. It is an attempt to solve the deep, festering solvency crisis of the United States economy by looting its closest neighbor. It is a desperate move. Healthy economies, healthy hegemons do not demand back pay from their closest allies. They trade, they invest, they grow. This demand is a symptom of an economy that has financialized everything, that has hollowed out its industrial base and is now looking for a cash injection to keep the bubble inflated. But here is where the dialectic kicks in. Here is where the contradiction exposes itself. For decades, the United States has operated under the assumption that it holds all the cards. The assumption has been that Canada needs the U.S. market more than the U.S. needs anything from Canada. This is the standard arrogance of the imperial core. They believe that because they print the reserve currency and because they have the largest consumer market, they can dictate terms unilaterally. Enter Mark Carney. Now, Carney is a man of the system, a central banker, a neoliberal par excellence. But he understands something that the populists in Washington seem to have forgotten. He understands the supply chain. He understands the material reality of production. You cannot eat dollar bills. You cannot fuel a tank with treasury bonds. You need oil. You need steel. You need uranium. You need electricity. And so Carney's response is not to negotiate the price. His response is not to say, oh, 2.8 trillion is too much. How about 1 trillion? No. His response is to pull the lever that exposes the physical vulnerability of the United States. He has triggered a national security review of key Canadian exports. And this, my friends, is the terrifying reality for the American capitalist class. Because when you strip away the stock market valuations, when you strip away the tech sector hype, the United States is deeply structurally dependent on Canada for its basic survival. Let's look at the receipts, because Carney certainly has. First, look at energy. The United States prides itself on energy independence, but this is a statistical trick. The U.S. refinery system particularly in the Midwest and on the Gulf Coast, is engineered to process heavy crude oil. Where does that heavy crude come from? It does not come from the shale fields of Texas. That is light, sweet crude. The heavy crude that powers the American industrial machine that produces the diesel for American trucks and the jet fuel for the American military comes from Western Canada. Carney knows this. He knows that if he turns off the tap or even restricts the flow of Canadian oil, gas prices in the United States do not just go up, the system seizes. We are talking about a potential doubling or tripling of fuel costs in the Midwest almost overnight. This is not just inflation. This is a heart attack for the American logistics network. The very blood of the U.S. economy is pumped from the North, and for the first time, the North is threatening to pinch the vein. Then you have to look at the minerals. We are moving, allegedly, toward a high-tech green economy. We are building electric vehicles. We are building advanced defense systems. We are building the next generation of digital infrastructure. All of this requires specific, tangible materials. It requires uranium for nuclear power. It requires nickel for batteries. It requires potash for agriculture. Who has these things? Canada has these things. The United States has spent the last 40 years outsourcing its mining and refining capacity because it was cheaper to buy it from elsewhere. This is the efficiency of the capitalist market. It seeks the lowest cost in the short term, ignoring the strategic vulnerability in the long term. Well, the long term has arrived. The United States Department of Defense relies on Canadian metals to build its missiles, its aircraft, its armor. If Carney places an export ban on strategic minerals, he is not just hurting Ford and General Motors. He is effectively grounding the U.S. military-industrial complex. The irony should not be lost on you. Trump demands payment for protection, and in response, Canada threatens to cut off the very materials that make that protection possible. And let us not forget electricity. We often think of the grid as a national entity, but it is not. The North American power grid is deeply integrated. Regions like New England and parts of New York are heavily dependent on hydroelectric power flowing down from Quebec. This is clean, baseload power that keeps the lights on in American factories and American homes. Carney has put this on the table. Imagine the political chaos in the United States if the lights go out in Boston or New York City because the president picked a fight he couldn't win. Imagine the rolling blackouts in the industrial Midwest. Electricity is not a luxury. It is the prerequisite for modern life. By threatening this, Canada is demonstrating that the relationship is not one of charity. It is one of mutual and perhaps asymmetrical dependency. What we are witnessing here is the shattering of the free trade illusion. For a long time, we were told that free trade would bring peace, that intertwined economies would never go to war, trade wars or otherwise, because it would be too costly. Marxists have always critiqued this. We have always said that free trade is a mechanism for the dominant power to extract value from the weaker power. But what happens when the weaker power realizes it holds the physical keys to the dominant power's house? The United States has treated Canada as a resource colony, a place to extract cheap raw materials while selling back expensive finished goods. That is the classic colonial model. But Canada is a developed sovereign nation with a state apparatus capable of fighting back. Carney is utilizing the state, the very thing neoliberals usually try to dismantle, as a weapon of economic self-defense. This confrontation also exposes the fragility of the U.S. dollar and the U.S. financial system. Trump is demanding $2.8 trillion, Where does he think this money comes from? It is a fictional number, but the commodities Canada holds, the oil, the uranium, the lumber, these are real values. In a conflict between fiat currency and physical commodities, commodities eventually win. You can print money, but you cannot print lumber. You cannot print aluminum. The United States is finding out that its financial hegemony is useless if it cannot secure the physical inputs for its economy. This is a crisis of the real economy versus the paper economy. The US has the paper, Canada has the goods. Furthermore, we must look at the geopolitical implications. If the United States alienates Canada, its closest ally, its neighbor, its biggest trading partner, who is left? The world is watching. Europe is watching. China is watching. If the U.S. is willing to extort its best friend for cash, what does that say about the reliability of the U.S. alliance structure? It collapses the legitimacy of American leadership. It tells the world that the U.S. is no longer a hegemon providing stability, but a desperate predator looking for its next meal. This pushes countries to diversify away from the U.S. It pushes Canada to look at Europe, to look at Asia, to say, we need customers who do not hold a gun to our heads. This is how empires end, not with a bang, but with a foolish, arrogant overreach that alienates the very supports that hold the empire up. The auto industry is another critical theater in this war. The integration of the North American auto sector is total. Parts cross the border 6, 7 times before a car is finished. An engine block is cast in Ohio, machined in Ontario, assembled in Michigan. If Carney restricts the flow of auto parts or the steel and aluminum required to make them, the American auto industry stops. Not slows down, stops. We are talking about hundreds of thousands of layoffs in the American Rust Belt, the very constituency that Trump claims to represent. It is a suicide pact. By attacking Canada, the U.S. administration is attacking its own industrial workers. It is attacking the very supply chains that keep Detroit alive. And Carney knows this. He knows that the political pain of an auto sector shutdown in Michigan is far greater for the U.S. president than the pain of a trade war is for the Canadian Prime Minister. We must also consider the role of ideology here. Trump represents a nationalist, protectionist wing of the capitalist class that believes it can wall itself off and loot the world. Carney represents the internationalist, technocratic wing that believes in managed interdependence. Usually these two wings cooperate to exploit the working class, but now they are at each other's throats. This is an intra-capitalist conflict. It is a fight between national capital and global capital. But make no mistake, it is the working class on both sides of the border who will pay the price if this escalates. Higher prices, lost jobs, instability. This is the fallout of a system organized around profit and power rather than human need. This demand of $2.8 trillion is also a deflection. It is a way for the U.S. administration to blame a foreigner for the declining standard of living in the United States. It is a classic scapegoating tactic. Why are your wages low? Why is your infrastructure crumbling? It's not because the American corporations shipped your jobs overseas. No, it's because Canada didn't pay its bills. It is absurd on its face, but it is a powerful political narrative if left unchallenged. Carney's response punctures this narrative by showing the material reality. We don't owe you, you need us. It shifts the power dynamic from moral debt to material necessity. Let us dig deeper into the uranium question. Nuclear power provides about 20% of U.S. electricity. The U.S. imports the vast majority of the uranium it uses. Canada is the largest supplier. If that supply stops, where does the U.S. go? Russia? Kazakhstan? The geopolitical options are slim. By threatening the uranium supply, Canada is highlighting a strategic negligence on the part of the U.S. ruling class. They allowed their own strategic independence to atrophy in the name of market efficiency, and now they are vulnerable. This is the contradiction of the market knows best philosophy. The market didn't care about national security. The market cared about cheap uranium. Now, the bill for that cheap uranium is political leverage. And what of the 2.8 trillion itself? Think about that number. It is nearly the size of the entire GDP of Canada. It is an impossible demand. It is a demand designed to be rejected. It is a pretext for hostility. It signals that the U.S. is not looking for a settlement. It is looking for a subordinate. It wants Canada to acknowledge its vassal status. But Canada, by virtue of its resource wealth, is not a vassal. It is a partner that has been polite for a very long time. And as the old saying goes, beware the fury of a patient man, or in this case, a patient nation. The politeness has evaporated, replaced by the cold, hard calculus of commodity power. This situation forces us to ask, what is a border under capitalism? Is it a line on a map, or is it a membrane through which value is extracted? For the U.S., the northern border has been a membrane for extracting value, cheap oil, cheap lumber, cheap talent. Now, Canada is turning that border into a wall, not a wall of concrete, but a wall of regulation, of export controls, of tariffs. And the U.S. is finding that it is on the wrong side of that wall. The U.S. is the one that is hungry. The U.S. is the one that is thirsty for oil. The U.S. is the one that needs the lights to stay on. In the coming sections, we will explore exactly how this plays out sector by sector. We will look at the specific mechanisms Carney can use to bring the U.S. economy to its knees. We will look at the panic that is beginning to set in within the boardrooms of Wall Street as they realize the Canada trade is no longer a sure thing. And we will look at what this means for you, the worker, the citizen, watching two capitalist titans wrestle on the edge of a cliff. But for now, understand this. The era of polite, unquestioned U.S. dominance in North America is over. The giant has stumbled, and the neighbor it tried to rob has turned out to be holding a shotgun. The $2.8 trillion demand was a gamble, a bluff, and Mark Carney has just called it. The cards are on the table, and they are covered in oil, uranium, and steel. The game has changed. Now we must ask the question that is always at the center of our analysis. Who pays for this? When two elephants fight, in this case, the American nationalist bourgeoisie, represented by Trump, and the Canadian technocratic elite, represented by Carney, it is the grass that gets trampled. And the grass, my friends, is you. It is the working class of the United States and the working class of Canada. We have to be very clear about how this trade war, this clash of capitalist egos, translates into the daily life of the average person. Because while Trump and Carney play 4D chess with uranium and interest rates, the fallout lands squarely on the kitchen table in Ohio, in Ontario, in Pennsylvania, and in Alberta. Consider the immediate impact of the supply chain disruptions we discussed in the previous section. If Carney follows through, if the tap on heavy crude is tightened even by 10%, the refineries in the American Midwest do not just pay more, they pass that cost directly to the consumer. This is the iron law of capitalist pricing. The corporation does not absorb the loss. The corporation protects its margin. So, the American worker, already struggling with inflation, already watching their real wages stagnate for 40 years, suddenly sees the price of gas jump to $6, $7, $8 a gallon. This is not just an annoyance. For a worker living paycheck to paycheck, this is a crisis. It means choosing between driving to work and buying groceries. It means the cost of every good transported by truck, which is to say, every good, spikes. The inflationary spiral that follows is not an accident. It is the direct result of a system that prioritizes geopolitical posturing over human need. And what of the Canadian worker? Do not think for a second that they are immune. If the U.S. retaliates with tariffs, the manufacturing plants in Ontario, plants that are deeply integrated into the American supply chain, will face slowdowns. We will see layoffs. We will see the temporary closure of shifts. The Canadian worker is told that this is a necessary sacrifice for national sovereignty, just as the American worker is told their hardship is a necessary sacrifice to make America great again. It is the same old lie. The ruling classes on both sides wrap themselves in the flag to hide the fact that they are picking the pockets of their own citizens. They use nationalism to distract from the class war they are waging against us. This entire spectacle, the $2.8 trillion demand, the threats, the counter threats, reveals the utter bankruptcy of the nation state as a protector of the working class in late stage capitalism. The state has become nothing more than a weaponized instrument for specific sectors of capital. Trump is using the state to try and extort rent for a declining American empire. Carney is using the state to defend the prerogatives of Canadian resource capital. Neither of them is asking, how do we ensure full employment? How do we ensure affordable energy? How do we build a sustainable future? Those questions are off the table. The only question allowed is, who gets the bigger slice of the profit pie? We are watching the disintegration of the neoliberal consensus that held the West together since the end of the Cold War. For decades, we were told that globalization would prevent exactly this kind of conflict. We were told that commerce was the great peacemaker. That lie is now dead. We are returning to a world of mercantilist blocs, of resource wars, of beggar thy neighbor policies. And in this world, the worker is nothing more than a pawn. The auto worker in Detroit is pitted against the auto worker in Windsor, not because they have different interests. They both want decent wages, safe conditions, and a future for their children, but because their respective ruling classes have decided to use them as battering rams against one another. So, how does this end? It ends, inevitably, with a deal cut in a back room, a deal that will likely preserve the profits of the oil majors and the banks while leaving the working class with higher prices and less security. Or it ends with a catastrophic rupture that accelerates the decline of the US dollar and the fragmentation of the global economy. Either way, the lesson for us is clear. We cannot rely on these leaders. We cannot rely on a system that treats the livelihood of millions as collateral damage in a dispute over tribute payments. We must build our own power. We must build a movement that crosses borders, that recognizes that the enemy is not the Canadian worker or the American worker, but the class that exploits them both. The $2.8 trillion demand is a farce, a tragedy, and a warning. It is the sound of a system cracking under its own weight, and it is up to us to build something better in the rubble. Thank you for joining me. I hope this analysis helps you see through the headlines and understand the real forces shaping our world. Until next time.